Okay, everyone. Hi, and welcome to the Hot Topics and Research Ethics webinar series. I'm Jeremy Sugarman. I'm here with Julia Patrick Enkeson, and she is going to start off and tell you a little bit about the Mores program, and then I'll introduce our speaker. You're on mute, Julia.
All right. Okay. So just before I introduce More, I would like to let you know that we have the previous session in this I think JSU as well as University website. All right. So I'm Julia Petrengasan. I am from Kuala Lumpur, University Kuala Lumpur. I'm one of the co-investigator for this project. So I'm going to talk to you about the program Master Health Research Ethics, or what we call as More. Right. More is a one-year full-time program, and it is developed in collaboration between the Faculty of Medicine, University Malaya, and the Burma Institute of Bioethics, Johns Hopkins University. And it is supported by the U.S. National Institute of Health for Getty International Center. And this is a program that is offered by University Malaya. Application deadline is every July or August. For this year, it is 31st of August. And the session starts every September, October. So More aims to produce graduate equipped with the knowledge and skill necessary to engage in the field of health research ethics. And we do offer scholarship for selected applicants from low and middle income Southeast Asian countries. Back to you, Jeremy.
Great. Thanks. Thanks so much. And we encourage people to apply. So it's a real treat to have Professor Emily Anderson join us today. Professor Anderson actually has another Fogarty project, similar from the same funding source as we're funded for the Mores project, and which happens to be located in Ukraine. And as a consequence, has encountered a set of issues given all the disturbance in the area. Emily has an MPH from the University of Illinois and a PhD from St. Louis University. She's currently professor at the Niswanger Institute for Bioethics at the Stritch School of Medicine. She's a member of institutional review boards and data safety and monitoring boards, so you can tell she's a good citizen. As well, she's an associate editor of Narrative Inquiry in Bioethics and a board member of Accountability and Research. She works on a variety of issues, including informed populations. Emily and I had a conversation about this at an international meeting about these issues, and I'm just so excited that she is willing to share her experiences with all of us. So she's going to plan to talk for a while, and then what we'd like you to do is to type any questions you have in the Q&A or the chat box, and then the moderators, Julia and myself, will try to address them during the discussion. The session is being recorded and will be made available on the Mores and the Berman Institute website so that you can access the session later on. And there will be, I want to tell you now, so I don't forget, and so you won't be surprised, an exit survey is going to open immediately following the webinar. It would really help us to improve the webinar series if you could answer just a few short questions, and your input there is greatly appreciated. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Anderson, and we look forward to hearing her comments. Thanks again.
Thank you, Jeremy. I love being introduced as a good citizen because that's really important to me. So I really appreciated that. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Can everybody see them? Somebody give me a shout or a thumbs up.
Yes, looking good.
Great. Okay. As Jeremy said, I direct a Fogarty-funded bioethics training program in Ukraine. I'm at Loyola University, Chicago, and my partner institution is Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv. I'm going to be introducing you to my Ukrainian colleagues and students throughout the presentation, but I do want to acknowledge them before I start. Due to the time difference, they are not able to join us. It's the middle of the night there, but I hope I represent them well. Okay. A little bit of background on our program. Our collaboration started in 2017 when I was invited by Father Ihor Boyko, who started and leads the School of Bioethics at Ukrainian Catholic University. He invited me to be a guest lecturer in their bioethics certificate program, which is a non-degree continuing education program for physicians and other healthcare providers, really the only bioethics education of its kind in Ukraine. I was actually the first lecturer to present in the program on topics related to research ethics. Little did I know at the time that in the audience was one of my future students who would, among other things, eventually establish an institutional review board at UKU. As many of you know, that is no small feat. After several more visits between 2017 and 2020, we decided to pursue Fogarty funding as the School of Bioethics at UKU wanted to expand their educational programming. And there are no graduate programs in bioethics in Ukraine, and bioethics is generally underdeveloped there, both as an academic discipline, as well as in medical education and clinical care, and as a framework for federal research policy. So we decided that we would start with doctoral training, and we aimed to identify Ukrainian MDs and PhD researchers who would complete Loyola's online doctoral program in bioethics, which we've had for over a decade. We prioritize individuals that have leadership potential, such as those with faculty appointments at medical institutions or affiliations with UKU, individuals who do research or are involved in research oversight or policy making. Rather than share a lot of program details, since I am going to talk about a lot of the challenges that we faced, I do want to emphasize that the foundation of our partnership, the partnership between Loyola and Ukrainian Catholic University, is really our common shared institutional missions. And I think this is really important as we have faced the last couple years with the war and before that, the pandemic. Ukrainian Catholic University draws on the traditions of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. Their stated values are hospitality, openness, transparency, non-bureaucracy, and communication. And their tagline is to know, to understand, and to respect. Loyola is a Jesuit Catholic university, one of 4 Jesuit Catholic universities in the US with medical schools and bioethics institutes. We draw on traditional Jesuit values focused on forming and educating our students to be agents of change, training our students and encouraging our students to be women and men for and with others, and caring for our students as whole people. And our institute director, Mark Kaczewski, recently, I think, articulated very nicely what has come to distinguish our Bioethics Institute and our faculty. And that is our commitment to accompanying students facing unique challenges. And that certainly describes our Ukrainian students. At the same time, UKU is very much promoting education as a way for everyone to fight the war in their own place. And here's a headline: the task of students is to study and rebuild our country. And I thought this very nicely showed our shared values and our shared commitment. Who are our trainees? We've had a total of 11. 10 are currently enrolled. One, unfortunately, is deceased. I'm going to talk a little bit about him in a minute. We have been funded now for just about 4 years, and our first 2 trainees will finish their doctoral degrees in May. Our trainees are primarily physicians, and most physicians, especially in primary care in Ukraine, are women. So we have a majority of women in our program. Primarily, they are from Western Ukraine. 5 of our students have faculty appointments in medical schools. 2 of these are PhD researchers, and 2 are affiliated with Ukrainian Catholic University. So getting to this topic of war, prior to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia on February 22nd, 2022, there had already been 8 years of conflict in eastern Ukraine between Ukrainian government forces and Russia-backed separatists. And this happened after then-President Viktor Yanukovych decided not to sign an agreement with the European Union. And this was going on, but it just wasn't making news the way the current war has been making news since the full-scale invasion. And you may recall in 2014, there were demonstrations referred to the Maidan or the Euromaidan protests in Kyiv, which is the capital city. Since 2014, this map shows this a little bit. Russia's controlled the Crimean Peninsula, and Russian-supported separatists have controlled parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions of eastern Ukraine, which are collectively referred to as the Donbass. And this map shows areas of Russian control prior to and since the full-scale invasion, although things have been changing and changing over time. But what I really want to do is acknowledge that there was ongoing violent conflict even when I first visited Ukraine in 2017 and when our bioethics training program started. It was just confined to the East. And I am very humbled and honestly a little bit ashamed to admit that I was naive to the impact that this long-term conflict had on some of our students and their families. And during my visits to Lviv in the far west and in Kyiv in the center of the country, the fighting seemed very far away at that time, even though it was happening. How has the war impacted our training program? Kind of before I get to the broader substance of war and bioethics, I'll start with myself. In February 2022, for me, the first couple weeks of the war were really emotionally turbulent. I would wake up in the middle of the night, check the news, exchange WhatsApp messages with my students. Other Loyola faculty were asking me about the students. Are they safe? What are we going to do? How can we support them? University administrators had questions about grant financing and things that I simply couldn't answer. I had no idea what was going to happen. And I just wanted everyone to be safe. And I wasn't thinking about bioethics or war in bioethics or the future of our training program, even though I had just been in Lviv in October 2021 with all the students, and we had made a lot of plans about their different projects. I wasn't really thinking about that. I was just wondering where everyone was and was trying to keep them safe. At the same time, I was watching what was happening at Ukrainian Catholic University, and it was amazing to see what they were doing. The university is, as you saw on the map, is located in the far west of the country in Lviv. They very quickly set up housing for internally displaced persons. A lot of students' families just showed up at the university looking for housing because they didn't have anywhere else to go. And UKU opened their campus to people with open arms. Programs were quickly established to provide food and social support and services, including education for young children. And UKU also became a central collection and distribution site for medical supplies and other humanitarian aids. And the university really transformed as they prioritized resources to develop new programs to support emerging needs, most notably developing new programs in psychology and physical rehabilitation due to both the physical and mental health trauma caused by the war. Every academic program at the university started to incorporate the war into their courses in some way through service learning models. For example, students in communication and computer science worked to combat disinformation campaigns. Students in education worked with young refugees from Eastern Ukraine. Business students were looking at supply chain, things like that. Many doctors and other healthcare workers left Ukraine immediately. I just recently saw a statistic that something like 40,000 healthcare workers, which includes physicians, nurses, and other healthcare providers, have left and have not yet returned. Of our trainees, all but one stayed in Ukraine. One was able to get out of her city, Sumy, which is on the Russian border, before it was occupied. She went to Poland and she actually treated she's a rheumatologist. She treated Ukrainian refugees in Wrocław and then returned a few months later upon deoccupation of her city. Some of our bioethics trainees who are physicians started learning about battlefield trauma or how to provide trauma-informed primary care to internally displaced persons. Many have been involved in gathering and developing resources for others. In the early days of the war, some were translating refugee patient medical records into other languages or frantically contacting colleagues in their specialties around the world to get medications. And a couple of our trainees have been pretty heavily involved in humanitarian work. But as they face these new challenges, their commitment to their bioethics education has become only stronger. There have been, they've had an increased commitments in terms of some of their family commitments and their clinical duties. There's been really unreliable internet and problems with electricity, although a lot of community resources are put into that in different students' localities. And we've had to pause a lot of our sort of extra enrichment activities and professional development activities so that we could support students to be successful in their core coursework. But I'm happy to say that everyone has stayed along with us and stayed and kept up the pace for the most part, with some some temporary leaves of absence here and there. And of course, the war has impacted trainees' areas of interest and focus of their scholarship, as well as my own. Before COVID, students came in very interested in issues of research integrity, plagiarism and data falsification and fabrication, publishing issues, predatory publications, non-peer-reviewed publications. All of that are big problems in Ukraine. Ethics of clinical trials, as Ukraine is a big site for clinical trials. I'll talk about that in a little bit more. Emerging issues in biobanking, IRB function and management as reviews, very pro forma. Those were things that were very central to students' interests when they came in. Between when COVID emerged, but sort of before the war, students started to get interested in issues of professionalism and obligation to treat, as well as things related to vaccine research, vaccine hesitancy, vaccine distribution. Since the war, students have started to focus on the impact of war on clinical trials, and particularly what to do with individuals who are being treated in clinical trials, as well as the obligations of sponsors. I'll talk more about that. The ethics of international collaborations, frameworks for trauma-informed research, ethical issues in research on humanitarian aid and in active combat zones, and of course, ethical issues in research with veterans and displaced persons. And we're all learning together as the literature and scholarship around these topics is somewhat sparse and scattered, and I'll talk a little bit about a project that we are embarking on to try to contribute to that scholarship. In the first few weeks after the full-scale invasion, one of our students, Dr. Max Basarab, who was an oncologist in Dnipro in eastern Ukraine, in a town that was very close to areas that were already controlled by Russian separatists, he started writing more to process his thoughts. And Max was a very quiet student. And as he was a bit older than the other students, his English was not as strong, as he hadn't had the benefit of learning English in school or in a formal setting. But in the very early days of the war, he told me he felt compelled to write for publication under the circumstances. He felt compelled to share what he was experiencing and his thoughts about how to address some of the challenges, especially challenges that oncology researchers and his colleagues were facing during the war. And so for several weeks in March and April, Max and I were in contact almost every day as we worked on co-authoring this brief analysis of the ethical challenges faced by oncology researchers. And then Max went on to write a personal essay sharing how he applied what he had learned in bioethics education to make decisions during this time when there wasn't really any good guidance about what to do, including his decision to stay in Dnipro and take care of his cancer patients while he sent his wife, who was also a physician, and their young daughter to Poland. And sadly, while we were in the process of working on these publications together, Max died suddenly. I think it was an indirectly caused by the war, perhaps due to stress. It's thought that he had a stroke. And in these, I've pulled some pretty powerful quotes from his essay. Max articulated a sentiment that all the students have shared with me at some point or another, and I've shared with our Loyola bioethics community. And this is really how the tools of bioethics have helped them thoughtfully, systematically, and confidently address unexpected challenges in situations where there's no clear guidance about what to do. Students have also repeatedly talked about how studying bioethics is one of the ways in which they fight the war in their own way every day. This is sort of a common saying, something that people are repeating a lot in Ukraine. In Ukraine, everyone's fighting the war in their own way, in their own place, in their own work. And they see the knowledge that they gain as not only influencing their present day work, their present day research, applying this to patient care and organization of healthcare systems, but it's also bolstering their ability to be able to contribute to rebuilding as Ukraine strives to reform governmental and social structures and eventually join the European Union. And I want to give, I guess, credit to Max for getting me really interested very early, and through my collaboration with him and his untimely death, sort of a commitment to these issues, to think about ethical challenges faced by clinical researchers in Ukraine during the war, and others around the world who are in similar situations. And despite the challenges of war and difficult moments such as Max's death, we still have a lot of accomplishments and a lot to celebrate. 4 new students started the program in January of 2023. 5 students have already completed the master's degree on the way to their doctorate. And as I mentioned, we have 2 students who are about to finish their doctorate in the spring. Here's some pictures from our recent September meeting in Krakow, where all Ukrainian trainees were able to meet with me and multiple other faculty members. It's hard for them to get to the US right now. Much easier for them to get to Poland, very easy for American faculty to get to Poland. And we were hosted by Ignatianum University, another Jesuit university in Poland. Very kindly, they let us use their space as classes hadn't started yet. One of our students, as I mentioned, has established an IRB at UKU. It's a behavioral social science IRB. There aren't any, the federal guidelines for research in Ukraine don't require ethics review for behavioral and social science research, but both because researchers at the university want to be able to publish in international journals, and the university wants to hold itself to international standards and higher standards than the country's regulations. They both had the benefit of the challenge of setting up this IRB without a lot of guidance from any sort of federal regulations. Another one of our trainees, Oksana Sulaieva, has been appointed to a national committee working on developing biobanking guidelines for Ukraine. The research ethics guidance in Ukraine really focuses on clinical trials, and in addition to not having specific guidance for behavioral social science research, there also isn't any guidance for biobanking, and Oksana is contributing to that effort to try to get some guidelines in place. Vladislava Kaczkowka, the student who was briefly a refugee in Poland, is now back at her university, Sumy State, again in the Northeast on the Russian border. She's going to finish her doctorate in May, and she's been asked by the dean of her medical school to develop a program of bioethics at Sumy State for faculty, for IRB and IACUC Animal Research Committee members, and for medical and PhD students focusing on responsible conduct of research and human research ethics. I also want to share that 3 of our trainees have narratives that are going to be published in a forthcoming special issue of the journal Narrative Inquiry and Bioethics, which is being edited by Donal O'Mahuna, Talia Arari, and Abdul Rahman Faraz, which is titled Healthcare Under Fire, Stories from Healthcare Workers During Armed Conflict. And there's a variety of stories from healthcare providers around the world who have faced ethical challenges during armed conflict. So now I want to focus for the rest of my time on sort of the substance of research ethics and war, and how the war has impacted research in Ukraine, both negatively as well as positively. I think there has been a couple of positive outcomes here, but just like lots of healthcare providers have left Ukraine, tens of thousands of scientists across all disciplines have been displaced or have joined the front lines. And educational and research institutions have shut down or been operating with limited capacity due to attacks on buildings and attacks on infrastructure. There's a lot of stories of attacks on healthcare, but also on educational structures as well. Many Ukrainian scientists have gone abroad. as many foreign institutions opened their arms, especially in Europe, to Ukrainian scientists due to the war. In fall of 2022, it was estimated that almost 1 out of every 5 Ukrainian scientists had left the country, close to 20%. The photo in the center here is from the recent attacks that happened on New Year's Eve 2023. Several buildings at Shevchenko University in Kyiv were damaged in these attacks, including the Institute of Biology and Medicine. The photo on the right was taken by one of our trainees, Dr. Oksana Suleyeva. She directs a pathology laboratory in Kyiv. And on February 24th, 2022, she had to relocate her supplies and staff, as well as she took all of her samples in refrigerated trucks from Kyiv to Lviv, so they could continue supporting patient care and research that was happening with those samples. In 2022, at the start of the war, the National Research Foundation of Ukraine stopped funding scientific research, and they transferred all of those funds to the needs of the Army. In 2023, funding was restored and new grant applications have opened. Many high-income countries, especially in Europe, have initiated special grants for researchers to collaborate with Ukrainian scientists. So the attention to the war has increased funding internationally, as funding in Ukraine has decreased a little bit. But most notably, for well over a decade, Ukraine has been a key location for international clinical trials. According to Global Data's clinical trials database, as of February 2022, so right before the full-scale invasion, there were almost 800 planned or ongoing oncology trials. Not surprisingly, many of these, if not most, have stopped either fully or temporarily due to disruptions in the healthcare infrastructure, limited providers, staff leaving the country, limitations on people and goods moving around, supply chain issues, and challenges in ensuring the safety and well-being of study participants and research staff. This has left many research participants without acute and chronic diseases, especially cancer, without access to the treatments that they were receiving in the research setting. One of the reasons that Ukraine was such an attractive place for clinical trials was that there were a lot of treatment naive individuals, newly diagnosed individuals with cancer, as well as chronic diseases like diabetes and also autoimmune and rheumatological diseases that were eligible for clinical trials and receiving arguably some benefit through participation. According to the Ukrainian State Expert Center, 45 clinical trials in various phases were put on hold. 132 were prematurely discontinued. Active recruitment stopped in 215, so about a quarter, and only a handful of those have resumed recruitment. 451 patients, it's been reported at last time I looked, mostly in oncology, but also in gastroenterology and cardiology, were transferred to other sites. And this includes about 170 patients that were transferred from sites in eastern Ukraine to western Ukraine, and almost 300 patients were transferred from patients who were receiving care in clinical trials. Almost 300 were transferred abroad to other countries, mostly in Europe. But I know I've heard anecdotes of patients, a couple of patients being transferred to Canada, but most of those are in Eastern and Western Europe. So really significant impacts on clinical trials due to the war. So some people might ask, I mean, why even worry about research during war? There's a lot of other things to worry about. Is this an issue that we should be thinking about? But research is needed during war for all the same reasons that we need research under more usual circumstances. We need evidence to support what we're doing. And health research conducted during armed conflict has produced many benefits throughout history. from Roman progress with public hygiene to anesthesia during the U.S. Civil War to penicillin during World War II, and certainly the research funding infrastructure, as well as our intramural research infrastructure through the National Institutes of Health in the United States, owes its entire existence to World War II. And obviously, war is a fertile setting for research on physical and psychological trauma that can be applied in broader contexts as well. So there's lots of reasons to keep doing research during war. We need research to determine if certain interventions, whether those are clinical interventions or public health interventions or social welfare interventions, are they still effective in conflict settings, or are adaptations necessary? There's need to collect data to document the impacts of war, and there's a need to collect data to assess the efficacy of humanitarian interventions, such as services for refugees and internally displaced persons. Billions of dollars of humanitarian aid have flowed into Ukraine, and there should be evidence collected on what is and isn't working. Evaluation and research is now well integrated into humanitarian aid efforts. And giving this growing emphasis on the need for research to continue, international researchers increasingly are going to want to conduct research in Ukraine and partner with Ukrainian scientists to conduct research despite potential challenges. How are the ethics of research during war different from the ethics of research during humanitarian crises? That's one of the things that I'm working on with Donald Omahuna, one of my colleagues at Ohio State University right now, through a Fogarty bioethics supplement that I'll talk a little bit more about. You know, obviously there are similarities and there are differences. Considerations for research during war are a little bit distinct from ethical considerations for research in other humanitarian emergencies. As in any limited resource environment, research can present therapeutic misconception, right? If someone offering services is also offering research, that can confuse participants about the potential benefits and their ability to be able to refuse participation in the research and still receive the benefits. This is a potential issue in any kind of humanitarian crisis, but I think there are reasons to believe that war refugees might be different from other type of refugees in ways that might influence their trust in researchers or influence their thinking about consent, or even potentially their ability to provide voluntary informed consent due to violence, political issues, and ongoing trauma. Long-term displacement, witnessing violence, those kinds of things that aren't usually of concern in natural disasters, for example. And in conflict settings, there are ongoing uncertain threats to safety of research staff, participants, and members of the local community. And there also is the concern that research might even risk compromising humanitarian action or threaten the principles of neutrality and impartiality. So all of this is to say is that there are ethical frameworks and ethical guidance, some here on this slide, for conducting research during humanitarian emergencies. Most international guidelines do not specifically address ethical considerations for research during war, or have any kind of specific guiding principles or suggestions for some of these issues related to maybe ongoing trauma, ongoing threats to safety, things like that. And there's also evidence that there's a real risk of insufficient adherence to standards of ethical conduct in research in humanitarian crisis settings. And so this, I think, suggests the need for more practical guidance and educational resources specific to research in war and other conflict settings as unique among humanitarian disasters, and also sort of makes the need to map the landscape of ethical issues that arise during research in conflict settings and develop specific guidance that much more urgent. So again, this is, we are now starting to map the landscape, think about conducting some original research and develop some resources specific to conducting research during war and other violent armed conflict. I think while research during war can be considered perhaps ethically imperative to the extent that any research is ethically imperative, it's ethically imperative to gather evidence to support what we do and how we distribute and use limited resources. I think due to unique contextual factors and the inherent vulnerabilities of potential subjects, conducting human research during war might also require meeting a higher level of justification in terms of the risks and benefits and the risk-benefit balance. Certainly, clinical trials to address public health needs caused by the crisis of war raise concerns about double standards and threats to informed consent, as I mentioned earlier. Additionally, as in the case of clinical research in Ukraine, war disrupts research that may have been providing beneficial medical care to patients who are limited in terms of other options for care, even in peacetime. Of course, we always need to be careful to remember that the goal of research is to generate generalizable knowledge, not to directly benefit those who are participating, but often in the case of research being conducted in low and middle income countries, there are patients that have limited options in terms of receiving treatments, and that can impact, again, the way we think about risks and benefits in those situations. Stopping clinical research might involve discontinuing treatment or discontinuing safety monitoring, and this might cause significant harm to individuals receiving care in the context of research. So even when a study stops, there has to be some thought put into how participant safety is going to be managed and monitored, even if that person isn't going to continue in the research long term. There's no clear guidance for weighing the risks and benefits of continuing or discontinuing trials at sites amid conflicts, or discontinuing or relocating individual patients. This is something that some different groups have been working on. But ultimately, the obligations of research sponsors from high-income countries have not been well articulated, and that's something that people will probably be quibbling about for quite some time. Initiating or continuing research might pose harm to staff and to participants, particularly as healthcare facilities are often military targets, despite international laws that prohibit such attacks. This is definitely something that we've all been hearing a lot about in the international news, as there are wars around the world, and healthcare sites are always sites of attack. And this is also something that we've been educating ourselves about. And looking at international efforts to basically put more teeth into some of those international laws. Like other humanitarian disasters, war poses challenge for review, given the overall lack and dispersion of expertise and the need for quick ethics review, in addition to the unique considerations. Something else that I've been thinking about as I'm thinking about the broad considerations for research ethics during war is that war attracts opportunists, right? Not just in the financial or business sense, it's also true in research. And this makes not just potential research participants, refugees, internally displaced persons, people living in a country. It doesn't just make them vulnerable, but it also makes scientists in that country vulnerable to exploitation. And just briefly, I've seen enthusiasm expressed by researchers for conflict settings as being great places to do research on psychedelics for PTSD, or on issues like tinnitus or tinnitus, as some people pronounce it. It's something that affects soldiers, but also affects a lot of Americans and people around the world, especially after COVID. So I've that's gotten me thinking about sort of war research opportunists and the potential challenges that might bring. Whoops, hold on. Let me go back to the slide. I still have a few more broad ethical considerations. But ultimately, you know, it's ethically imperative that the research conducted in Ukraine or in any country that is being affected by violent conflict addresses the needs of the Ukrainian people or the people who are in those circumstances. Ukrainian researchers have key roles in identifying those research needs and ensuring that research is conducted ethically, as do the citizens themselves. And this is really why bioethics education and expertise, and especially that's specific to research conducted during war, is critical to enable Ukrainian researchers to actively and equitably collaborate in research partnerships and to adequately respect and protect Ukrainian research participants. And the last thing I want to mention, and this is something that we certainly have wrestled with and had lots of conversations with among our Loyola faculty and our students, war raises questions about the ethics of scientific collaboration. And just as economic sanctions against aggressors are a powerful political tool, there have been debates about excluding Russian scientists and scholars from collaborations and international conferences and journals, and even calls for pharmaceutical companies to discontinue clinical trials in Russia. Moving forward, and I'm wrapping up here and hoping to have some time for questions and discussions. We recently obtained some supplemental funding from Fogarty to help us learn more about the ethics of research during war and eventually contribute to the scholarship, sort of a combination of capacity building and mapping the terrain through shared learning, some original research, and ultimately we hope to develop a casebook that sort of brings all of these different topics, trauma-informed research, research with refugees and veterans, clinical trials, impact of war on clinical trials, sort of brings those into one place and one resource with some interesting dilemmas and analysis of those dilemmas that are taken from real world experiences. As I mentioned, I'm collaborating on this project with Donald O'Mahuna at Ohio State University. He's an expert in humanitarian ethics and the ethics of conducting research during humanitarian emergencies. In our project, as I mentioned, we have this series of activities to support the development of such resource. We hope very soon to start conducting in-depth qualitative in-depth qualitative interviews with researchers who have recently had the experience of conducting research during active conflict, as well as individuals who've been involved in ethical review of such research, so we can sort of parse out what are the unique ethical issues and what's a little bit different from other kinds of humanitarian disasters. And again, we ultimately want to develop a casebook that will cover a broad range of topics relevant to research during war across a wide range of disciplines and methods. And we had a couple seminars on topics relevant to war, conducting research and research ethics during war in November and December, and we have a few more scheduled in February and March. And so if anyone has a particular interest in this issue, feel free to reach out to me and I can get you the link to register for those seminars. We're going to hear about research ethics at the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, talk about the potential for re-traumatization, ethical considerations and mitigation strategies for re-traumatization in research, and then also hear from someone from the VA in the US about the ethics of research with veterans. So we're very excited to start getting more into the substance of research ethics during war, and again, conducting some original research and contributing to the scholarship on this issue, which is for now very sparse and somewhat spread across a variety of different topics, journals, disciplines, and places like that. So thank you so much for listening to me, this combination of sort of story and substance, and I'm happy to answer any questions or hear any thoughts that others have about these issues.
Well, great.
I'll
So
stop
Emily,
sharing so
thanks.
I can see everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was fantastic, and the combination of the stories and the lessons learned is really really helpful. I think it puts a human face on things that are happening. Unfortunately, even at greater frequency, right? So
Yeah.
it's not just the issues in Ukraine, right? We have Israel and Palestine and other outbreaks and forms of violence around the globe. So it's a really critical issue. We have a couple of questions in the Q&A. The first was from an anonymous attendee who writes, indeed, during war, there are high levels of anxiety, as at any time, researchers and participants are going to be attacked. I'm wondering, what are the practical safeguard measures that could be done?
Yeah, and I guess I'll interpret this question as being asked about what was done in the clinical research settings. And I know that what I've heard more anecdotally about this than anyone has reported systematically. Some sponsors and research sites, went to really great lengths to try to continue to reach people, give people their medication, do remote monitoring, or relocate them at sites. Every site had to make a decision about whether or not it was safe to continue. And I think the biggest challenge was at the very beginning of the war. It was really unclear, was the West going to continue to be safe? Was that a good strategy, or was that just sort of kicking the can down the road? I think now we've seen that Russia's strategy is, and I'm certainly no no expert on political strategy or war, but their strategy seems to be to use their limited resources by every once in a while doing attacks and then laying low for a couple months and then going back with attacks. So anywhere is sort of open to potential attacks. Attacks on infrastructure are really challenging when medications need to be kept refrigerated and all of that. And so I think, my answer is that what I've heard is that different sponsors and different sites made different decisions based on a variety of different things. I think including the desires and and I don't want to use the word dedication, sort of the people on the ground. Did they want to stay there and keep doing it, or did they go? Did the sponsor feel comfortable continuing to fund that study? And you can see, not every study stopped. Not every study stopped enrolling. There's a variety of different things that can happen, and that was really what people have been struggling with, is sort of everyone was making these decisions based on the fly, on their gut, trying to figure out how to apply our standard principles of research ethics, but not really knowing how they apply in this situation.
Okay, great. I'm gonna. It's really tough to answer. I'm sure that's lots and lots of experiences wrapped up in one answer, right?
Yeah.
So let me see if Hunter Smith, who's a U.S. Army physician, has a good question in the chat. I'm gonna, Hunter, I don't know if you're able to talk, but I'm gonna allow you to talk here on the chat. And if you want to do that, if I hear you talk, I'll be quiet. And if not, I'll read. I'll practice my reading skills by reading what you wrote.
Right. Hey, everybody, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, terrific. Yeah, thank you very much for your excellent presentation, Dr. Anderson. So basically my question is very, I think, directly related to my day job work. So I'm an Army physician. I am conducting and sponsoring several infectious disease surveillance projects in Ukraine and variety of other global infectious disease projects with some of our research partners there. And so this is a topic that I've thought about several times in terms of these kind of meaningful ethical differences in conducting public health surveillance projects versus clinical research projects, particularly in these active wartime contexts. At first blush, it seems to me that conducting disease surveillance may be a little bit less ethically fraught rather than full-blown clinical research trials, in terms of a lot of the considerations that you mentioned in terms of the consent process. And to me, opportunity costs is a major one as well, because you mentioned in your presentation, many researchers and physicians flee these conflict areas. And so those that remain are very heavily purposed for performing direct patient care. And so asking them to do like oncology trials for chronic diseases when there are very pressing concerns, trying to balance that. So sorry. Go ahead. Thank you.
No, I mean, I have two comments. One is that, this is something my students would roll their eyes at because I say it all the time, but like our traditional research ethics frameworks are not good at helping us account for opportunity costs, right? And the risks of not doing the research. That's not really part of our, the traditional Belmont framework. And we need to start thinking about different types of guidance, maybe for what you might call like macro level issues. Your question about differences in conducting public health surveillance kinds of studies versus clinical trials, I'm going to give the good researcher answer and say, I don't really know. And this is why we are really looking forward to doing in-depth interviews with people who have done research on the ground, because we haven't, that kind of information hasn't really been systematically gathered and analyzed about what kinds of challenges people really are facing on the ground. A lot of it has been really anecdotal. I think, like you, there's like lots of reasons that lead me to want to say, oh, it's not as hard if you're not delivering an intervention, right? And you're just collecting data. But there are certainly some of those safety considerations and things like that come into play. So we're very interested in hearing from people, and I have written your name down and might be interested in reaching out to you to talk to you more about your own experiences.
Data gathering without IRB approval. Okay.
No, we're gonna get IRB. The reason I haven't started is because I'm waiting on my IRB approval. So
yeah, I got it. I got it. Only kidding.
All right.
Thanks.
So we have Jeremy. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Right. So the question is, time and scarce resources are not a good combination during wartime. How can we ensure that the fundamental principle of research ethics are upheld at this time? Especially the justice. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think that's a great point that I just want to highlight, that time, limited time and scarce resources are sort of the enemy of research ethics and responsible conduct of research. We know that ethical violations and compliance violations happen in the ecosystem of people having too much on their plate, not enough time, feeling like following the rules is going to slow them down or keep them from doing something important. So I think that's a really good point. I don't know if I have a good answer to your question of how we can ensure that these fundamental principles of research ethics are upheld at this time, most especially justice. I think having conversations about it like we did during the pandemic, and sort of deciding as a community and declaring really publicly, right? There are not, we don't make allowances for what we were calling pandemic exceptionalism, right? Like, we don't loosen our standards just because things are urgent. We don't loosen our standards just because we feel that resources are short or we don't have as much time. And I think that's having those conversations is the way to get started. And then we solve the problems together. That's kind of a weak answer, but that's all I got right now.
I think it's interesting that you pointed out your observation of looking across research ethics guidelines about the justification for doing research and stronger justifications for why research is happening. I think there's some move to that. It's sort of in this nexus of scientific value, social value, but we need to really, I think, articulate that. The thing that occurred to me as you were saying that is another area that's come up, I think, as a result of your experiences and also COVID, was this need, and it came up in your comments about the need to attend, and the comments of some of the participants about the need to look at staff, the dangers to staff in settings. And that's a really enormous issue that's been dodged, right? So it's in certain very, very super infectious disease research and things like that, those considerations come up. But I think COVID taught us that, and this wartime piece really is part of the calculus about, if you look at research ethics as a whole, how to handle that. And I wonder if there's any way, any practical guidance that you have started to offer, or is any of that being entered into sort of ethics review processes or anything like that, given the recent experience?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm interested in hearing from Fiona Terry at who heads the IRB at the ICRC about. I know, I've sat on, as you mentioned at the beginning of the talk, I've sat on a bunch of different IRBs, and I live in Chicago, Illinois, which for those of you from around the world don't know, we have a reputation of having a lot of violence in our city. And when you sit on review boards, IRBs in Chicago, sometimes this issue does come up when you have staff who are going into dangerous neighborhoods, or we do a lot of research in our city on gang violence because that's one of our big public health problems here. And I've definitely been in conversations as an IRB member about whether or not it's appropriate for us to have those conversations, make those recommendations as the IRB. Is it something that we just wish researchers were a little more sensitive to in their planning? Is it something that the institution or the funder should be the one pulling the levers on, or having more influence on? Because again, it's not really something that it's not part of that traditional risk benefit calculus, right? It's the benefits to participants in society versus the risks to participants, but it's definitely an important issue, and it falls under that bigger umbrella of, I think, also on the other end of that teeter-totter is the opportunity costs and the potential risks of not doing the research. So I think we have some expansion of our frameworks
Great.
that we can do. Yeah.
So, just as we're closing up, I don't see any other questions. The one other thought I had is, I didn't hear you discuss the publication issues in detail. And during COVID, I was working with a group of folks who were interested in coming up with what happens when research is disrupted. And I wondered if you'd had a look at the conserve guidelines or any of the guidelines that have come up to talk about how we can account for the unpredictable in research. So whether when research is disrupted and because of a pandemic or any other kind of disruption, we want to learn from those data if we can, but we don't want to have bad data, right? Because bad science is bad ethics. So I threw up the link to, it's an open access publication for Conserve for people who don't know about it, but I just
thank you for mentioning that. I think that's a really important issue that we need to get on our sort of list of things that we're thinking and talking about. So I am
great.
I'm gonna put that in my I'm gonna cut and paste that so I don't lose it.
Gotcha. Yeah, and it's really, I think there's one final last question. I don't know if you can answer this one in a minute. It's quite complicated, but maybe you can just point people in the right direction, perhaps. How has the social teaching of the church influenced the practice of bioethics during this conflict? It's a really important question, and go for that, and then we'll finish up.
I mean, I think my quick answer is I return to, accompaniment, which is a sort of a classic Jesuit principle, but also I think a Catholic principle that's shared both in the Greek Ukrainian Church and the Loyola Church. Whether you're talking about accompanying your patients, accompanying your research participants, or accompanying your students, I think that principle of just being there and listening to them and adapting to how, to what they need. I think that is sort of the biggest influence across, we have a variety of faculty and students who embrace church teachings at different levels. I think that's one that's everyone can get on board with, and is something that has definitely influenced my approach as I went from thinking, feeling really helpless and stressed out, and realizing that the best thing I can do is just accompany my students as they learn and apply, all the tools of bioethics to their daily lives, which are getting more complicated.
Well, what a great way to end. And thank you so much for a fantastic webinar. For all the participants, please remember to answer the survey so we can bring you the kind of content you want and speakers you want in the future. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great.
I love hanging out with other Fogarty programs. So good to meet everyone, even though I can't see you all.
It's great.
All
Bye-bye.
right. Bye-bye.